Uh, Hi, everybody. So I thought we would look at the path a little bit more. We've been really like the meat of this program is really looking at the Eightfold Path as something to cultivate. And as Gregory Kramer puts it, finally, I find a term that I can stand behind: a whole life path. Very succinct, very clear. And that's what I want. I want this. I want my whole life to be my practice. Because one of the things that gets in the way is I feel like I have my practice. And a lot of times I feel like my life actually gets in the way of my practice, and then I get irritated about that. If I didn't have this thing or this person or this place or this conflict or this money problem or this job or this politic or this, the world seems to be like in the way of my practice. And so that really can kind of create this bad situation for us. I think that a lot of people have fallen into where we have a practice, we have a Dharma practice, and then we have the rest of our lives, and we somehow see them as different things. And I think that the meditation culture, insight culture, has kind of been stuck in this trap for 40 years to some degree, and not really sure how to get out of it or what to do about it. You've probably sat with them at the end of the retreat. Usually they'll do a talk on how to take the practice home, and it's usually a very clumsy talk because you sort of can't take this home. The retreat experience is a very unique, very rarefied, very important time to really cultivate the mind and to really be in the Dharma experience with the distractions removed, with food being provided with you. In many ways, being in a monastic kind of environment where we really get to do that. Now, you're not going to be able to do that on a Tuesday morning in October, probably at your house. Maybe if you're lucky. And so we kind of want to try to get a sense of this. So to just start, John Peacock mentioned this actually in our call. And I'd heard it before, but it really sunk in where he said the most basic definition of the path, the most basic definition that goes all the way back to the section of the canon that I'm sort of obsessed with lately called the Sutta Nipata. And the Sutta Nipata is understood to be really the oldest aspect of the Pali Canon. The language is very, very different. The tonality is very, very different. There's lots of stories. There's lots of metaphor. There's lots of metaphor and analogies around comparing Dharma practice to being an artisan, being a farmer, being a potter, being a woodworker. So there's a lot of really emphasis placed on the fact that this is something that can be done in the world. Right? And also it's also an aspect of the canon where we see the Metta Sutta. Some of you probably have heard or read the Metta Sutta before. That also comes from the Sutta Nipata. So that Metta stuff, the Sila stuff, this stuff is really old, which some people would say, and I would say I put a little bit more weight on stuff that's a little bit older. And so the most basic definition we have is to abandon what is unskillful and to cultivate what is skillful. Right? Like we've probably heard that before. But I didn't get that message when I first started meditating. I got the message like I needed to learn how to concentrate. I needed to be in my breath. And it was all this emphasis on technique. It wasn't really an emphasis on the quality of the mind that I was developing. And I think that really what we're talking about, there's no really way to deny it, that the most basic definition of the path is an ethical dilemma or an ethical game, an ethical practice. And so it even takes, I would even say, like courageous integrity. The path is a path of being courageous about actually having to live with integrity, which is hard. Very hard. And so that's where this all begins. And so just to look at the Pali, some of you probably know this word. Unwholesome is also it's also the same as we would say unskillful. We use skillful and wholesome are synonyms, and they both come from this Pali term akusala. Akusala means unwholesome, kusala means skillful. And that this is really, really what the Buddha is trying to say. This is what we want to overcome, and this is what we want to develop. Another way to think about it, also that I put up there in the definition a little bit more, is also harmless. Kusala means harmless, it means skillful, it means wholesome, it means constructive. Right? So he's trying to say this is the path. That's the direction of the path. The path goes towards the wholesome, towards the skillful, towards what's beautiful, we might even say. And so that's really where we want to go. That's the direction we want to go. And we want to, and I like this word abandon. Sometimes abandon and overcome are used exchange. I tend to use the word overcome, but the word abandon is actually much more, I think, accurate. And the idea that I'm going to abandon that which is harmful kind of sounds righteous in a personal way. I know abandonment in our culture kind of had a negative connotation, right? But really, like, how do we abandon, that which doesn't serve us? And so when I sit down and I close my eyes, with this kind of message and this definition of the path, it doesn't feel like a very passive endeavor to me. It feels like I'm actually being asked to do something. I'm not just being asked to just sit here and concentrate on my breath so much. I'm not being asked to kind of manufacture something so much, or just kind of watch. And I think that that's the message a lot of people have gotten in practice, is that that we just sit and we kind of watch, and we don't really kind of get involved. We kind of let things come and let things go, and we don't want to cling. And that's not bad or wrong. There's certainly an aspect of that that's very valuable. We definitely want to be able to do that. But for what purpose? And at some point, is there a step two? Where does it go from there? Because I think this dry just being able to watch can make us a little bit cold. It can make us a little bit indifferent. And it can make us feel as though like we don't really want to actually participate with life so much. We just kind of want to be these passive bystanders on the sideline of life, watching things go by without wanting to get too involved. Right? And I've done that, and I didn't enjoy it actually very much at all. And it's really easy to kind of take that on. So if we look at the emotional intelligence work, they do a good job here. I want to make sure my notes that I did. So the other way to look at this, the other way to look at these terms, I think is good. And I think the emotional intelligence people do a good job. And I'm more likely to use these terms, is destructive and constructive. Unwholesome sounds too moralistic, maybe. Skillful is definitely better. But this idea of something that is destructive and something that is constructive. And so that we find that we, as much as we want to be able to recognize these aspects of the mind, so the watching, being able to observe experience, is only beneficial in its capacity for us to recognize that which is destructive, abandon it, and to recognize that which is constructive and cultivate it. And so that's a little bit of a moment-to-moment game, right? So there's some discernment. So we have to be able to recognize qualities of our own mind that don't serve us. And that brings us into really kind of the definition of these, which also comes from emotional intelligence. And I think they do a good job. And when something is destructive, that means that it's incompatible with my sense of happiness, with my sense of contentment, with my sense of well-being. It's incompatible. It doesn't serve me, and it doesn't serve anybody else. And that's sort of the criteria for what's destructive. Now, unfortunately, the Buddha doesn't really unpack this as much as sometimes it does in the secular world around emotional intelligence. Although we do get these massive lists, these massive taxonomies of terms that are like, we have hindrances and we have awakening factors. We have certainly a lot of that. But in the early discourse, it's not so much clearly defined, except for this word harm. I think is really important to acknowledge that we don't want to cause harm to ourselves and to other people. And so in what ways do we cause harm in our mind? In what ways do we, before we even act, or before we even behave, or before we even do something that's behavioral, what is going on in the contents and the experience of my own mind that I can discern, or that I can recognize and say, actually, this is unskillful, this is unhelpful, this is unwholesome, this is destructive. And much of it, and I think much of the work that we do, and especially in our culture, and you've probably seen this in your work, is that much of the ways that the things we need to overcome and abandon are just the ways that we feel and how we think about ourselves. I'm a bad person, self-hatred, I don't do this, that. Like that seems to be a lot of like work right there. Right now, I haven't even said anything or done anything, but a lot of it is like, how do we take that on in a way that's not aversive? So how do I not have aversion towards that? That's the other thing that makes it so complicated. It's like I can see the negativity arise in my mind, the feelings I have about myself, and I can immediately say, well, I'm supposed to abandon this, and now I get into aversion, and now I'm just trying to push it away. You notice that? And so you can't use the hindrances to abandon destructive mental states. I know, it's kind of irritating because it seems like they would work fucking really good. so then that becomes kind of an interesting way. So we have to really kind of sit and work with this stuff. And this is really, really a slow grind, I think. And then we look at constructive or skillful or wholesome. We can use all these terms interchangeably, but I think it's important to see that the Pali term is akusala and kusala, which are words that don't get used a whole bunch. Usually we hear about defilements, we hear about hindrances, we hear about the three fires, greed, hatred, confusion. They're all part of the same packaging. But I think that really this kusala, akusala is really, really kind of the meat of where this is all going. And so things that are constructive are things that are compatible with my sense of well-being, with my sense of happiness, with my sense of contentment, with my sense of ease. And a lot of times, the thing that makes it so hard, I think, is that I don't always see those. Like, I definitely see the other side. Like, akusala is pretty easy to notice, right? So the question becomes, and there's a lot of different theories about this, but it's like, well, on one hand, it's like, well, you just clean out the akusala, you clean out what's unskillful, and then you uncover the skillfulness that's already there. That's one thing. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I'm sure it's partly true. But the other part of it is like, how can I cultivate or recognize something that is skillful or wholesome or constructive and bring that into being? So to cultivate, bhavana, means to take something that's sort of not happening yet and make it happen. So, the seed and fruit analogy does wonders here. And we know the Buddha he always talks about cultivate. He doesn't really talk about meditation. I think this word meditation also is part of the problem. Meditation is not a word that we see any Pali correlates to. It's kind of more of a religious side of thing. It really just means to think about something. People say, in a polite sense, if you have a conflict with somebody, sometimes they say, oh, I'm going to meditate. Which means they're not going to actually do jack shit. It basically means like, yeah, I don't agree with you, but that's okay. I'm going to meditate on that. So how do we cultivate these things? So I'm just going to pause there for a minute and let Eileen reflect a little bit on some of this stuff. Because I want to hear what you have to say about this kind of most basic definition.
I think that just hearing you speak, I started reflecting on this action of meditation, of mindfulness meditation, and what you were saying about kind of the observation, and it's possible to get kind of caught up and just kind of observing, kind of in the background, and not getting too involved. For myself, I came at mindfulness meditation from a completely different experience. I came from a place of kind of burning up, of my background, my upbringing, lots and lots of emotion. How I was raised as a Roman Catholic, like the burning heart, like being on fire, of compassion or suffering or sadness. And also, to couple a little bit to my cultural background, a tiny little story that's relevant to me, at least. I remember going on retreat and Vinnie Ferrara was teaching, and he said something like, how can I be Italian and Buddhist at the same time? And I was like, yeah, how can I be Mexican and Buddhist at the same time? I'm not being Mexican American. I came from such a fiery background, not just that, but, and so coming into this kind of observing gave me a lot of equanimity that I didn't have, that I wasn't raised with. And so it's impossible for me not to be involved or to feel like really strongly about almost anything, but it kind of gave me this a little bit of a balance. What I also wanted to say is that this kind of cultivation of abandonment, how this works, I feel like within any kind of, just the basic, even if you're just observing the breath or the body, or even if there's kind of like a bare awareness practice where you're allowing different mind objects to come and go. That in and of itself is kind of a kind action. That is the planting of seeds of what it is to practice with not feeding necessarily the voices of criticism or critique or evaluation. The instructions can be very simple and not always easy, but to observe, to see, to feel, and to experiment with what that's like, and not to feed into all of these different trains of thought, some of them quite unwholesome. So I think there's that first level. I think of it as like a developmental level of meditation. Because then there's that first level of work that really needs to happen, that acceptance, that allowance, that seeing and letting whatever is there pass. And then, that's not the only meditations that we do. That's not the only practice that we have. Then there's the kusala, the cultivating. When we get into, for example, could be one of many, for example, the Brahma Viharas, our heart practices. We're not just observing, we're actually now fertilizing the soil. Hopefully, we have some of our mindfulness practice or some of our bare awareness practice of just noticing, observing, letting go. And now it's time to do something else. We don't just stay there. Now we are cultivating the heart. So that's the balance. That could be a wonderful balance, and often is. That before maybe some of us may go into the indifference or the cool observation, because we've been possibly doing that over and over again, of just kind of noticing and this cool remove. Now it's time to kind of juice up, to kind of work the heart. So this is the two wings of practice: the abandoning, not feeding in to these any particular mind states, but especially the criticism, the evaluation, and now it's the wholesome. So these are ways that we're training the mind and how to be. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, that's awesome. Yeah, that's right. And I think one thing that starts to happen is when you start to get the Brahma Viharas and the kindness, it actually does feel good. It feels good to be like, oh, actually, I do like myself, or actually, I'm not so bad after all. And I actually do want to create positive change in the world. And, that actually there's a lot of joy and a lot of contentment in that. But I don't think that necessarily happens if we're just kind of watching too much all the time. So then the question becomes, what is the application? Like, well, how do you, okay, yeah, Dave, I'm with you, sounds good, right? Well, how do you actually pull that off? What's going on here? And so he unpacks it a little bit further. And we started off I'm pretty sure we started the whole course with that video on right effort that you might have watched in Mizuku, like that. That's how you do that, right? So this whole effort thing is how you do this. And so we have these 4 terms. So I want to walk through these a little because they're all quite different. There's one thing that I'm told, and I think it's true, is that the Buddha spoke more about right effort than anything else. Seemed to be his most talked about concept. There's a lot of words for it. There's actually a thing, this book that I've been reading, Rupert Gethin's PhD dissertation on what are called the Bodhijangas, the factors of awakening. I think in the Mizuku there's a list of all those. It's like 7 different lists, which isn't that bad. 7 lists isn't too many. But he talks about this. He talks about this formula in the Kayas, and he calls it the Padana formula. Samapadana formula is given as a straightforward explanation of the 4 efforts on 8 occasions in the 4 primary Nikayas. That's the 4 different sections of the canon. The formula is in fact as found as frequently in some other contexts. For example, on several occasions, the formula is given an explanation of Same Vayama, which is right effort, or right effort, the 6th factor of the Eightfold Path. Similarly, the formula is also used to explain the faculty of virya on many occasions in the discourses. So what he's saying is that every time he brings up this idea of effort, you get these 4, whether he's talking about virya, which is actually usually translated as energy, but that's not so good because the word energy is kind of a useless word. Let's be honest. Energy, I don't know about you, I can put energy into all kinds of fruitless endeavors. And I do, most of the time. Have you ever put energy into something that you had no business putting energy into? Right. But have you ever put courage into anything that was fruitless? Like, that doesn't really make sense. Courage always has a positive connotation. In fact, you mentioned it, Derek. Didn't you say there's a yoga pose that means virya or something?
Yeah, Virya Vidrasana is like a warrior pose.
Yeah. So in the Pali, when they talk about virya, they talk about the state of mind of a hero. Pretty big, right? So with virya as courage, it means that like that really what we're trying to engage in is a kind of courageous integrity, like taking on the burden of having to live in this world with some actual integrity, and actually that it takes courage to do that. So virya also shows up in some big places. Virya is, this word virya is also the third factor of awakening in the 7 awakening factors. That's the term that we see. It's also in the 5 spiritual faculties. When they say energy, it's not, a lot of times it's translated as effort, but it's not vayama, it's virya, it's courage. And so I think that I credit Brene Brown for her work, because I think courage is a word that nobody really cares about anymore. Like, whatever happened to good old-fashioned courage? Nobody seems interested in courage anymore. People think courage is this thing people used to have like in the days of the Greek and Roman gods. Those guys were courageous. And so I think courage actually really helps to bring the path alive. Like to do this, you know, cultivating what's skillful and to abandon what's unskillful isn't just some like meditation technique that you be good at. Maybe that's part of it, but it's a whole posture towards life that says, yeah, I'm going to choose to do the harder thing, you know? And so I think that really brings it up a little bit. So when you see virya as courage, I think it's good. Vayama, we have 2, I'll give you the 2. Effort is the most common translation. I think it's actually application. So vayama also is the term, is the translation for effort. Anytime you see the Eightfold Path, it's always that word. It's always that word. So that's very, very clear what that is. And every time the Buddha talks about right effort, he always gives you these 4. And Gethin points it out. And these are all through the canon. He's always coming back to these 4. Now there's other 4. What's another list of 4 that gets more attention than the 4 efforts? 4 noble truths. Big time. This is, I think, a much more useful way of looking at things. Now this other word, padana, is actually the word that no one talks about. This is the one that is most used. And I like this word too. Endeavor. Padana means an endeavor. So when we think about what we're doing about something that's courageous, something that's an endeavor. I think an endeavor is a good word. A lot of times I'll use the word, the whole Buddhist endeavor. People say this endeavor that we're taking on, this cultivation of this path, this endeavor. It takes effort. Again, effort's like energy. Like I can put effort into all kinds of stupid shit. And I do. So I think effort, again, as a translation, doesn't really, and also sometimes I think it's translated as right striving, which is for, Anne laughs because she knows what I'm talking about. Does anybody strive a little too hard? Yeah, so, or sometimes it's even translated as exertion. That's not helpful. Striving, exertion, effort. But when you start looking at courageous, endeavor, I think application is the word, because it's actually the Buddha's trying to get us to apply ourselves. Right, so let's look at these 4 real quick. So we have, so the first 2 are about abandoning. So the first one is to prevent. And what are we trying to prevent? Unwholesome things and unskillful construct these, you know, we're trying to prevent these things from arising in the mind, right? And how do you do that? How do you prevent something that hasn't happened from happening? Awareness, cultivate. But how do we have to live to be? What's the sila? So this is all about ethics. Like if I don't, you know, the Buddha always says, you know, it's really hard to meditate after a long day of lying and stealing and murdering, and you know, you go home, you feel terrible. Have you ever had a job or done anything? Or have you had a bad day where you kind of did a bunch of unskillful shit, and you get home and you're just like, I can't even sit with myself. I'm gonna like eat peanut butter and jelly and watch TV because I can't even deal with what I've just done. For those of you in recovery, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, to the point where you have to keep doing the terrible thing to medicate the terrible thing that made you feel terrible in the first place. Right? So prevention is all about sila. The other one, the second one, if you don't get it there, then we have to overcome. I use the word overcome. We can also use abandon here. And then we want to develop. And then 4, maintain. Right? So we have these 4. So we try to, so these just map onto this. You just get a little bit more specificity that we're trying to prevent these things by living with courageous integrity and trying to be a positive person in the world and all the things that you're already trying to do that you probably don't necessarily give yourself credit for. And I think that's one of the things that if we're going to do this whole path life thing, I think one of the things that we actually have to learn how to do or relearn how to do is to give ourselves credit for all the good shit you're already doing and have already done. You know what I mean? I think that we just don't actually do that. Now, if you make a mistake, you recognize that you did that. If you do something harmful, but the other way to think about it is harmful. But the other thing is also to do what's beneficial. Now, I think that's actually a really useful world too, because I think when I look at my day and my life, and a lot of us can do this, you can look through the day and notice and recognize that you did things that were of benefit. And now I think it's a little bit more, packs a little bit more punch actually than skillful or wholesome or even constructive, beneficial. I did something with my kids benefited from that. My husband benefited from that. My coworker benefited from that. My friend benefited from that. I took that phone call. I didn't really want to take that phone call, but that person really benefited from that phone call. We're oftentimes doing things with benefit, and we don't have that built into a mindfulness practice. We're not mindfully watching and congratulating and feeling good about what we do for benefit. And I think that we actually have to add that, and that much of us, we have to add that and start to realize actually you're probably doing that a lot of the time, but you're not really tracking it. Or you feel as though you should have supposed to have been doing it anyway. That's what I call the near enemy of that. The near enemy of doing things and congratulating ourselves for benefit is the feeling or the attitude. Yeah, I kind of probably should have been doing this all along in the first place. Now I'm still just trying to catch up with all the shitty things. You know, we get in that karmic scorekeeping. Like, you know what I mean? So I think that that's really something that you have to factor in, realize, acknowledge, track, however you want to think about that. But if you're not doing that, you're kind of missing out on lots of really, really great things. So, and the thing about it that's so beautiful is as you track it and as you're more aware of it, you're more likely to do more of it because you will start to notice that it actually feels good. You know, I'll give you an example. Actually, Beth, who's not here because her cousin, she grew up with one of her best friends, actually died. And Beth doesn't usually call me, but I was putting the kids to bed the other night and we had a fire going and we were hanging out the house and my phone rang and it said, Beth E. And I was like, and I was gonna let it go to voicemail. And I was like, yeah, she doesn't really call very often. I'm like, I should probably take this. You know, and I did. And you know, and I'm really glad I did. And I even after that, I'm so glad I didn't let that go. You know, but a lot of that's why there's the courageousness too, because a lot of times the initial reaction or the initial thing that comes up is we have to like, I don't really want to. You know what I'm talking about? I already have too many. I have too much. I don't really want to. Right? And it's like little things like that are totally massive, and totally huge. So then we can overcome these things. And so I think the middle to overcoming and developing are really where meditation practice is really actually you can. The reason I want to map this out is you could probably spend the next 3 days working on this, because you know as things arise, we can discern to some degree whether it's a mental state or it's a mood or it's a kind of a habit hijack of a kind of hindrance, I'm craving, I'm aversion. And we can kind of get a little bit sophisticated about recognizing the quality of that. And that can be overcome by either going back to the breath or sending kindness to it or all these different things that we do. So I think that you have this kind of sweet spot as soon as you take like an obstacle to practice and you turn it into an object of awareness, you kind of get that really bait and switch. So you can turn hindrances into awakening factors simply by recognizing them. Like, oh man, I'm like really full of aversion this morning. Like, I just come into the hall and like, the lights aren't right, the chairs are weird, that dude's breathing weird, why is she sitting like that? You know, like the whole thing, you just come in. And that's not what's going on. You just come in and you just realize you just take your mental state and just throw it on the room, you know, without realizing that that's what's going on. And so that becomes, and this is like kind of going, in a way, this is kind of moment to moment on some level. You know, like I can watch things come up. That's why I like driving, because it's like I drove out here yesterday, Monday, whenever the hell it was. And driving in Utah. First of all, the speed limit is 80 miles an hour, so I can put this cruise control at like 85, and I'll drive 2 hours and not see a car, like not even see another vehicle. So I get to like, I just watch. I like watch fear. I watch all this stuff come up, and it's just like, it's amazing. And the thing that's also so hard is that the destructive ones, the Kusala ones, sometimes have a little bit more of a compelling grip to them. Like, I'm more likely to entertain them for some silly reason. Right? And I think that's part of that habit. Yes, dude.
Are you open to questions? Or
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
This is super helpful. In where I could get a little bit unstuck, I get stuck a lot of places, but is around being able to discern if something is destructive or constructive. And is it so binary? Sometimes I'm asking what feels like being non-harmful or beneficial to me or to somebody else, that might be coming at a cost and actually be harmful to somebody else.
Yeah.
Like Robin Hood, stealing from the rich to give to the poor.
Yeah.
So is your experience that things are objectively wholesome or unwholesome? Can they be both, depending on from whose perspective it is?
I don't know that it's both, and sometimes I just don't know.
Or could something be neither, and you don't
Yeah.
have to overcome it, develop it?
I think so. I think there's probably like a range of those things, actually. So it's not always like the moments like everything is like, overcome or develop. It's not necessarily that simple. I think there is a nuance of things. And then there are things I don't actually know. I don't have the discernibility yet. Right. And so that becomes more ambiguous or more, but in that experience, I can cool down a little bit and say, well, I just don't know, and I don't need to react, or I don't need, because then it can get too, we can get kind of clingy around overcoming and developing. Like, it can get to be a little bit too aggressive. So it's a kind of something you just kind of got to check it out and trust that like at least you're aiming the right way. And so sometimes you don't know, and there probably are things. There are actually, we'll talk about this in the last day, we'll do this again in a different context around dependent origination. But there's categories in the Abhidharma. There's a category that's called universal mental factors. There's this mental factors that are all there. And there's another set of categories that are technically called the universal ethically neutral mental factors. They're just, like desire is a universal ethically neutral mental factor. Is desire wholesome or unwholesome? It's neither, it's both. It just depends on where the desire goes. Decision is one of them. Thinking and analysis are also those. So there are categories of experiences that are ethically neutral, which I think is what you're asking, kind of.
There's that, and then there's the example of, as an example, doing so much charity work or work for the good of people, but at the same time your relationship's suffering because you're not giving enough to the
right,
or creating something for the people you love, but maybe it's taking away from people you don't know.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So they can get really, but that's why we have to realize that this map or this way of thinking about it is very, very subjective, and we have to kind of be in the, like, I'm not really sure about this yet, or seeing what's underneath it, like probably like the near enemy, like a lot of times like generosity can really come from greed, or like generosity, like the example you're giving, like I'm helping all these people, I'm giving to charities, I'm trying to change the world, but I'm starving and so are my kids, and I don't give people I love any attention. Well, that's not so good. So it's not really generosity, actually. It's masquerading as something else. So then we just kind of have to sit, and then we start to get down into what's more in the roots of these people. What is this arising out of? It looks like generosity, it feels like generosity, it has the intention of that, but actually it's coming from a place that's causing harm. And so, we have to kind of, over time, we start to learn these things about ourselves. So it's not always so clear. But there is a category, there is room and space for ambiguity, for what's called ethically neutral. It's not wholesome or unwholesome. It's actually really what it is. It's not unwholesome or wholesome yet. Like desire is a good example. Desire can go, a lot of different ways. In fact, there's a whole, I don't have the book, I want to get it. There's a book written as a PhD thesis of a Pali scholar. There's actually 19 terms in Pali that mean desire. 19. So they were onto something. They were like, yeah, this desire thing is like a mess, actually. Yeah, it's a good question. So let me ask you this. We go with that other list of 4. If we think about mortality, what is probably the easiest, one of the ways, if we're trying to prevent and to try to have this sila, what do we really need to try to do? What's the a project that we have to undertake to try to really to get this going for us?
Vigilance?
Vigilance is a tricky word, but there's another set of 4. Somebody mentioned them. The correlation between this set of 4 and this other set of 4. 4 noble truths. Now, dukkha, right? So if we want to try to prevent, what we need to do is we need to embrace dukkha. Now, if I embrace the difficulty in my life, I typically don't react, and I can kind of prevent myself from doing a whole bunch of fruitless things. Now, the other thing to flag, I think, here is we all know, let's be honest, that the whole thing is about ending dukkha. Whole goal of Dharma practice. You read all 99% of the books on Buddhism will tell you the goal of practice is to end suffering and to end dukkha once and for all, which I don't think is actually true at all. I think it's a big problem. But if we look at like ending something versus embracing something, let's think of some examples of that. First of all, ending something has so much aversion built into it, doesn't it? Right. So if we're trying to end suffering, if that's kind of the goal and the message that we get in this work, we are already digging our heels into the ground of aversion right away. Not only into the ground of aversion, but first of all, I'm going to find that I'm probably actually not able to do that. In fact, actually, now that I have more mindfulness, I'm actually seeing more of it. Now I'm actually doing it wrong. So not only am I suffering, but I actually suck at suffering too. Have you ever been in that space? You're like, not only am I not, I'm actually like having a hard time, and I'm like really like I'm bad at this. I'm making more of it. Now, if we look at some like real obvious examples, let's just go with a real obvious one, like climate change. Do you really think we're ever going to end climate change? No. Is there a possibility that we can embrace climate change and actually acknowledge that climate change is a thing and have a constructive, cooperative conversation about this thing, embracing it by saying, okay, like, let's at least acknowledge that this is a thing, whether we're going to end or not end, and we got it, and then it becomes no more gas cars and no more, and all of a sudden it's just ending, and all this has got to go. Every car on the planet, people aren't going to stop driving gas cars. People aren't going to stop eating beef. Like these things are not going to happen, right? And so that ending creates that kind of reactivity and creates that kind of divisionness and that kind of yes and no and creates that kind of polarity, right? Where embracing is very different, like racism. Do we really think we're ever going to end racism? No, there's nothing wrong with wanting to end racism, but we're not going to do it. But could we embrace it? Could we as a society, as a species, as a culture say like, this is actually a thing that's happening and we need to embrace it, we need to look at it, we need to discuss it, we need to see that there's a lot of dukkha in it. A lot of the problems in the world, especially the social, political, environmental, a lot of them are things that people think that we need to end, right? Which is fine, it makes sense. Of course, nobody's going to argue. Yeah, it would be nice to end racism and climate change. Of course it would. It would be nice to end political polarity. But it's not going to happen. And so when you make this shift from ending to embracing something, they're very, very different things. Right? And a lot of times in mine, I can tell you that I can give you countless examples, how much my quest to end suffering around particular conditions in my life have just created so much more. I get into defensiveness, I get into blaming, well, I wouldn't be suffering if you didn't act like this. You know, all of this kind of thing. So this, and the word is a very tricky word, is parinya, which means to fully know. You know, there's actually, the Buddha doesn't even, the word end is like, he only uses it in the context of dead ends. He starts off the teachings of the Four Noble Truths by saying the dead ends, the dead end of nihilism, the dead end of eternalism. the dead end of self-mortification, the dead end of sense pleasure. I think in our context, what we're talking about is the dead end of poverty, the dead end of capitalism. I think how that manifests in the world right now is that we don't want to be have a poverty mentality, but this capitalism thing isn't really working out for people either. So there's a middleness. Embracing has a very middle kind of flavor to it. Ending is not very middle. I mean, it's like it's as far on the spectrum as you can go. Right? You see what I mean? Now, this one, so if we want to prevent these harmful, destructive states from arising in the mind, we need to embrace life. We need to embrace dukkha. We need to come to terms with all kinds of things that we don't want to come to terms with. You see how different that is? Because people say to me, "Oh, Dave, you're all obsessed about these Four Noble Truths, and why don't you get over it?" And they're either way, they're saying the same thing, and I think they're not saying the same thing at all. And so when you put the efforts in front of it, they really start to come a little bit alive a little bit more, because now you're being asked to do something. You're not being asked to, do you believe in dukkha? Like whatever, whether you believe in it or don't believe in it. It's not a belief system, it's a behavioral system. That's why Stephen Batchelor has been for 10 years now, I've been harping on these aren't truths, they're tasks. They're not truth-based claims. They're not an explanation or description of reality. They're task-based ethics. And to embrace dukkha and to embrace the difficult things in our life actually takes a lot of integrity. It takes courage. Right? You know, it takes so much courage to do that. Yeah.
So you were saying, I think you were saying at the beginning that there's aversion built into wanting to prevent something, but it doesn't have to be, right? I mean, it seems more like you're saying, I mean, whatever, like if you have a little kid and there's like an edge that they could fall off of, like you want to prevent that.
You want to create an
You want
end.
to put a fence or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know that there has to be aversion built in there, right? It's
Right.
more of like caring, right?
Yeah, right.
To prevent that, and you could have that attitude towards your, like it seems to me you're saying like it is actually important to like do it without the aversion, because and then if you go to the social things that you're talking about, racism, climate change and whatnot, the thing we get into is like we look at the thing and then we go, it shouldn't be like that. Right? It's fucked up that it's like that. Like that's the aversion, you know what I mean? Instead of just like taking positive action to do something about it. I don't know. I'm just trying to see where you're.
It doesn't always, but I think largely it can very much turn into that, or it can turn into fear. Like I'm afraid of my kid falling off a cliff. So
Yeah.
every time I go somewhere where there's a height, and I might just it can really turn on us pretty quick.
Yeah.
So it's not all bad or wrong necessarily, but I think in that idea is there's a kind of lack of willingness to wanna be in the experience.
Yeah.
There's a kind of lack
Yeah.
of willingness to want to be in it, like. And the other thing that's interesting too, if you look at it from an emotional science lens, the correlation they make with aversion is actually the emotion of disgust. Now, the reason why people don't want to acknowledge racism and in particular climate change is the idea, the fact that we're going to destroy our planet is disgusting. That like, I don't even want to fucking go there.
Yeah.
I don't even want to talk about it.
And they actually go in the other direction.
actually
And
go in
actually they just say it's not real.
That's right. So disgust and aversion are very much linked up. So a lot of like racism is having disgust towards racism would make a lot of sense. It's like, oh, that's a terrible thing. Like either I don't want to acknowledge it or I don't want to embrace it or I want to pretend like it's not really happening, which is of course what white people get to do because we don't really have to deal with it so much. So a lot of this stuff is really built in to kind of how do we engage with life and engage with the world without getting into these kind of painting ourselves into these habituated patterns.
Dave,
Yeah.
I would just add something.
Please, yeah, totally.
So, I definitely wanted to go back a little bit to Virya just for a moment.
Yeah.
I just wanted to step back a little bit to address kind of like the place that our practice has with Virya, courage. I say this all the time in class, in groups, wherever I can, that our practice and mindfulness meditation, our bare awareness, whatever practice we're doing in meditation, whatever we're doing at that time, this is a lab, like an experiment in courage training. We're very much asking within the instructions, you're asking of yourself to sit with whatever is coming up. That is courageous. And I don't think we give each other enough credit for it. And I don't think it's recognized enough in just basic mindfulness instruction, that what is going on can be difficult, it can be stressful, your foot can hurt, and you're going to be like, I want to leave, but we're asking you to stay. And these are these micro moments of courage. And so we're training the mind, inclining the mind to courageous choices, to make that choice, to maybe I won't leave, I'll just maybe move my foot, or maybe I won't. I'm feeling kind of sad, maybe I'll stay here and cry in front of these people. That is a courageous choice. And then, you know, the more and more we do this, the more and more we're able to sit with these conditions, the conditions of being a human being, and we allow ourselves to be human. And, you know, when we're off the cushion, the more likely we'll have this groove in the brain that will allow us to really face the honesty of what it is to embrace dukkha, to embrace the existence of dukkha. Because we're asking you, you're asking of yourself to embrace these micro moments of dukkha, to embrace their existence. This is true, this is true. Right now it's like this, right now, right now, right now. And sometimes that's like, I don't want to answer the phone, I'm here. But it's like that courageous decision of like, oh, I'm gonna break this reverie and I'm gonna answer because I know I need to. That's another micro moment of courage. So that is the practice too. We're building upon these courageous efforts. I also wanted to address kind of how I see my take on embracing dukkha. I think like within my practice, so crucial to embrace the existence. Like this is what it is to be a person, and to suffer, and to have heartache, and to exist in these finite bodies that are subject to old age and death and disease. So that's real, that's reality. And the courage to always kind of face that is where we're getting some grounding, and how to, as Dave put it, to really have a constructive relationship with our minds, with our bodies, with our hearts, with reality. Is kind of recognizing what is actually here and what's not going to go away. To have a body is to have some pain at some point in life. Not all pain, but it's going to happen, right? I also think that there is something to, perhaps for me, I think of ending, it's kind of maybe ending the power that kind of denial and disassociation may have. It's like the more aversion, the more aversion, the more aversion. It's like it just becomes so much more powerful. The dukkha becomes so much more like, the more we ignore it, the more it grows. It's kind of almost like, you know, what we hide, what we stuff down, what we like don't want to deal with, the more pressing it is. So it's like, how can we really face it where it's not like, I see you. Like, I see you, Mara. I see you, dukkha. So then it's almost like the paradox of the dukkha being lessened. That's the ending for me. Mm-hmm. The ending of that destructive clinging.
That's
The
right.
whole. That's the. It's not that the
But that's
conditions
second
were
novel
separate.
truth territory.
Yeah. It's that the pain is never going to go away.
That's right.
It's the extra
Yeah.
is what doesn't need to be there. We're still going to be human no matter what. So the humanity of it. And I also wanted to speak a little bit about racism as a woman of color. Identify as a woman of color, a brown woman, a Latina, mestiza, Chicana. And for many people of color, and you know, definitely for myself, there is no ignoring racism. It's we live and breathe, and it's in our face every day. So that's not a choice. So I wanted to put that out there, the voice in the room, to be very real about what is in some people's reality, that sometimes other people who are not people of color, that could be a privilege to just ignore it, or like, well, you know, isn't that sad? That's not something that we get to do. It's very much a part of our experience, the dukkha of our lives. That never goes away. I would like to think that there is maybe perhaps in society, kind of a great turning for people who are white. I would like, this is kind of like, to really recognize what is here and the harm these systems cause people of color, and to do something about it. It's not just our responsibility at all. So that's a work that is virya, that is courage, that I'd like to see happen. That's not something that is up to me or any person of color. That's what I want to say.
Thank you. Yeah. So I want to stay on time, which we're doing pretty good. We'll get to the rest of these four because we could go on these forever. But I think what you're pointing to, Eileen, is I think where the confusion gets from is that what we're trying to overcome is the reactivity.
Right.
I use the English on this one because the Tana doesn't work. We're trying to develop Nibbana, and we're trying to really cultivate the path. So, this is like, I think what the ending, not that we're gonna ever end clinging and praying, but that's the thing that we need to be working with. Is that we get them confused, I think is what happens. We get the Dukkha and the Tana confused all the time. And sometimes it's like, I actually think one of the hardest things to do in my life is to be able to like, is this Dukkha? Or is this me like not happy about the Dukkha? Like, and it's not like there's a line. It's not like there's Dukkha and then there's this, and it's really kind of a mess. But you ever have that moment like, is this just life being hard right now? Or is this me like really like not, or is it maybe a little, if you're like Noble Truth 1.5 that has an overlap? So I don't know. So what I want you guys to do now, let me just pause the recording. I think I can do that with Zoom. Zoom, you're so good. Thank you. I love you. Appreciate it. Let's look at the path factors. I just want to first point out something very, very interesting about the path, the Eightfold Path. Now, as you probably know in traditional sense, what does the Eightfold Path lead? Where does the Eightfold Path lead to? Yeah. Nowhere, anywhere in the pages of the Pali Canon does that language exist. The idea that the Eightfold Path leads to the end of suffering is a much later invention. It's not actually in there. Actually, where the Eightfold Path leads to, like, did I write down the page numbers? That's a big one. I believe I did. It actually leads to a city, of all places. And so the Buddha says this: practitioners, before my awakening, while I was still a bodhisattva. Oh no, I'm gonna go down a little further. Suppose, practitioners, a person was wandering through a forest, would see an ancient path and an ancient road traveled upon by people in the past. They would follow it and see an ancient city, an ancient capital that had been inhabited by people in the past, with parks, groves, ponds, and ramparts, a delightful place. Then that person would inform the king or the royal minister, "Sire, know that while wandering through the forest, I saw an ancient path, an ancient road traveled upon by people in the past. I followed it and I saw an ancient city, an ancient capital that had been inhabited by people in the past. Renovate that city, sire." Then the king or royal minister would renovate the city, and sometime later that city would become successful, prosperous, and well-populated, filled with people, attained with growth and expansion. That's where the Eightfold Path goes. I don't know if you ever heard that. I was very taken by that. So the Buddha isn't actually interested in describing how things are. We say the Dharma is an understanding of how things are, right? We hear this. It's actually how things could be. He's very interested in how things could be if people kind of got their shit together. So, and also if you look at what his hope or his message for humanity has yet to be realized. So he was really actually, like, and I've talked about this before, I don't want to digress too much, but on one hand, we can see the Buddha as a historical religious figure, no problem there. Or we could see Siddhartha Gautama as a man who was actually a social activist whose vision and dream has never been realized. Which is actually more likely, if you had to put him in a category, he would definitely fit under social activist than he would under any other category, actually. Social activist / kind of like therapist. Is probably where he would fit in that. So so when he talks about the Eightfold Path, he also uses another analogy. When he talks about the middle way is always the Eightfold Path. And it doesn't lead to the end of suffering, it leads to actually human flourishing. People say, well, what's the difference, Dave? You're always harping on this thing. What's the difference? Well, I think they're very different. Like, I spend a lot of time trying to end suffering, and I can say mostly fruitless. There was some benefit from that, but I really am interested in trying to flourish. And so the idea of a city that's thriving, that's well populated, that's prosperous, that's inhabited by people, that is a much more of a sense of something that's being cultivated and created rather than some internal mechanism that's being destroyed.
So it's not even individual flourishing, it's.
Has nothing to do with the individual,
human
actually.
flourishing. Yeah, relation.
Right. See what I mean?
He's saying the ancient path and the ancient people is just what humans have always done, and there's a different way.
We don't know actually why it's interesting because it's a story about a city, we know that it comes from an early discourse. Because the older the stuff is, the more story. So first of all, this is a whole other thing to digress, but like, how did the Buddha even know about cities? They didn't even have cities back then. How did he know about, of course, there's some theories about that, but he's talking about ideas that he would not have access to. So where did he learn about this stuff? And he's really looking at the world, and he's like basically looking at society and the way people live and go, they're like, no, this is not the way we want to go. This is not good. This is not going to work. You know, he was pro-woman. He was letting women into the monastery, which was really controversial. He said the caste system was some shit they made up. He said, there's no caste system. You guys made that up to control people. Like, he did a lot of really things. He was very, very involved and very, very engaged with his culture and his society. He was not just sitting under a tree in the middle of the woods. Like, he wasn't doing that at all. He was mostly dealing with this kind of stuff. So it's a little bit more exciting, I think, to see him that way. And it's actually much more canonically accurate to see him that way. And so we're trying to get to this city that's flourishing, that's alive, that's not there yet. Yeah, please.
I think for me, the way my practice has gone and kind of the outgrowth of my own practice, I think there's just this wonderful paradox here of like dukkha is always there, you know. It's never not there. To be a human is to experience it. And what is also true is that for this flourishing to take place, to constantly be in suffering, how could you flourish in that? So and to do this practice, the cultivation, the flowering of the practice, it's not a logistical, analytical, like, this is a tool and I'm going to do it. It's like you're planting seeds for a harvest. The outgrowth is a lessening of suffering. It's like you put in the work in a way, you put in the effort, the virya, all of this. The practice, there's going to be a flourishing. It's not, let me just make it up and force myself to not feel so bad or force myself to end this. That doesn't work. This is a kind of a organic process of what it is to be a person, to be a part of I think of it as just another creature on this earth. So we practice, we cultivate, we're planting seeds in the garden, and then the flourishing can happen.
That's right. Yeah, it's like we're flourishing in spite of it, not instead of it.
Right.
You know, it's like it's both and. It's like, yeah, it's like, you know, it's like, and that's where the courage,
No
I think, comes
lotus from the
alive.
mud.
Yeah, no mud, no lotus. I mean,
Right.
that's the ultimate analogy right there. You know? So let's look at some of these path factors. One thing that I'm going to do now, and hopefully we'll be able to finish, because I bit off a little. I always bite off more than I can chew. I don't know why. I think I'm like 3 hours. We have plenty of time. Actually, we don't. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. So what we're going to do is go through the path factors and retranslate some of them, and then we'll talk about it. Let me just get them up. So this one's actually not so bad. Ditti, if you translate it as view or really position. So I would call this perspective rather than view. Because actually the Buddha always speaks of views in a derogatory tone, except for when he talks about right views. Like he talks about fixed views and clinging to views. So when you see the word ditti in the Pali Canon, it's mostly not a good thing, unless it's sama-ditti, then it's a good thing. But to just flag this word sama, I was looking in the Pali English dictionary earlier, and the original meaning of the word sama comes from a family term meaning dear. So when you call your wife or your husband, oh, hey dear, good to see you. That's actually where sama comes from. It's way different than right. Way different. So we have, the translations, we have complete, right, good, proper. The other thing that's an interesting thing about sama, every time the word sama is mentioned, almost all the time, it's always associated with the Eightfold Path. They don't use it, Buddha doesn't use it very much. When Sama's in there, he's always talking about the cultivation of the path. And so I would say it's adequate and appropriate. Adequate meaning good enough. I know some people didn't like this recently. And also appropriate. And Gregory Kramer pointed this out, and I've never seen anybody else point it out. He actually says it means working together, which means it's constructive, it means it's cooperative, which means it's kusala, skillful. So view, perspective, position, that's right. This is the one I'm going to flag, is I'm going to take the most creative liberty. Sankappa is usually translated as what? Intention or thought. Sometimes volition. Now, actually, the thing about it is, and I push back on this, Sankappa does not mean intention. There's no way it means intention. There's actually perfectly other good words in Pali for intention. Chaitana. Chaitana is a Pali word that literally means intention. Thought. We also have another Pali word for thought. Vitakka, vichara, thinking analysis. We have those. The Buddha could have, if he meant right intention, he would not have used the word Sankappa. Sankappa is a really hard word to translate. It's associated with samkara. Stephen Batchelor actually translates it as imagination, which I think is a little bit useless. I actually am going to go so bold as to say that it's actually habit. That's because I don't know about you, but I have all kinds of intentions that never panned out. My mind is loaded with intentions. I think intention doesn't really quite do. So based on the perspectives I have, I develop habits. So we can talk about that. I'm gonna leave that alone for a second. Vacha, what's the usual translation for right? Speech. Speech or communication. I'm gonna write small, you won't be able to read it. I think we've talked about this. I think that the easy way to talk about this is voice, is finding our voice. I think that makes the whole, because usually what is right speech? The 5 things you shouldn't do. It turns into rules really quick, right? And so people say, right, well, that's not, we were going to we said that's not right speech. I'm like, oh, you want to hear some more not right speech? That's where I go. I'm like, oh, cool. You want to see it not? You're like, I'll totally go not right speech right now. So I think it's voice. Commenta, now this is another one that I think is another one that's really problematic. What does commenta usually translate as? Action. Okay. Well, that's totally wrong. There's another Pali word for action. What is it? Karma. I mean, that's like if anybody on the planet knows any Pali word, everybody knows what karma means. Karma means action. If the Buddha meant samakama, he would have just said samakama. It's such an everyday word. So the fact that he would use it, so what does it mean? It means work, business, occupation, or vocation, which to me sounds more like livelihood. Yeah, right, it sounds more like that. But I think this word vocation, which also is related to the word voice, vox. Now, vocation also has a religious connotation, which I actually like in this particular context, because a vocation is something that I feel called to do. And what called me to do something is some kind of inner voice. I felt called to be a priest. I felt called to be a teacher. People have callings. It's like a thing that we talk about, a vocation. So I'm gonna call it work, and I'm gonna do a slash here. I know some people don't like this, but I think this is okay. I think it's actually about purpose, which I've gotten some pushback on before. Work not meaning what I do for money. That's the next one. Work is in like you go to therapy, you do your work. You go to recovery, you do your work. You come on retreat, you do your work. What is your work as a person? What is your dharma? What are you trying to do, man, with this life? It's a big, big thing. And if we just think about it as action, it gets too narrowly defined into behavior. It's all about behavior. right? Which is fine and also part of it. Of course, how we behave is important, but it limits the idea of actually doing our work, and it also denies a little bit the inner life. This one, again, not too bad. What's the usual translation for Ajiva? Livelihood. Which usually we usually think of this action, we usually think of occupation. Livelihood literally means what you do for life. It means sustenance, which is an interesting term. Means of survival. If you look at Ajiva in the Pali English Dictionary, the term that really sticks out is means of survival. How do I get the means to survive? Well, I think survival is the right word. And in our culture, in our context of our life, what do you do for money? That's how you survive in this world. If you want to survive in America, you got to have some money. And so, which is kind of a little bit of a flip with these a little bit in some level. But I think that being in the Dharma world for so long, one of the things that people struggle with and being mentoring people for so long is like people, like for me, like every day, like this is a big ticket item, man. And if I get a little PTSD, like I'm dictated by survival is like alive in my mind all the time. Now, if I take it as a path factor and say, I'm going to take on the dukkha of this, because this all has dukkha in it too. It all has dukkha in it, it all has reactivity in it, it all has nibbana in it, and it all has cultivation in it. It's just a matter of how you go about it. So, because a lot of times I feel like if I didn't have to survive, I would actually do my work. And a lot of people feel that way, you know, and the thing about it that's so hard is they have to work together. And we unfortunately have to a lot of times be doing them at the same time. We have to be doing all of this at the same time. Right? Effort, no problem here. Vayama, effort. I think though I'm gonna go with application. And then it gets a little easier. No way am I gonna try to retranslate sati. Let's just go with mindfulness. And then this one, I think the three problematic ones are Sankappa, Kamanta, and Samadhi. Intention, I don't think really means intention. I think it means my habits. I think my livelihood is what I do to survive. And then Samadhi, which is, what's the common translation for Samadhi? The last path factor? That's terrible. I'm gonna go, so Samadhi, let's just look at the Pali in this picture. It means to collect, or to gather, or to bring together. Now that sounds a little bit like concentration, but not really. I think the only word that we can really go with here is integration, which I think is a great word. Is that when I bring something together, and I collect something, and I gather something, and I bring it together, I'm integrating. Right, so the purpose of right concentration of samadhi is to bring all of this together. So as I live my life, I have perspectives. Based on the perspectives I have, I develop habits. Based on the habits I have, I express myself through my voice. I create lots of work for myself in the process of doing so. I have to survive in this world. I have to apply myself with mindfulness and integration. So why don't you guys go back in your groups? You can do the same groups if you're not. If you want to, or different groups, but I just want you guys to just talk about this. What do you like? What don't you like? I don't want to give you too much of specific prompts, but you know what I'm saying, right? All right. Sorry, I went faster. I want to make sure we get through everything.